Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. This must be one of the most frustrating and even heartbreaking anniversaries in memory. 10 years ago, the so-called Arab Spring erupted in Tunisia and soon spread eastward, challenging entrenched regimes and bringing new or naive hopes to suppressed populations. But nowhere have these hopes been dashed more cruelly than in Syria, with millions killed, wounded, displaced, or exiled. The Assad regime clinging to power by whatever means at its disposal, and Russians, Iranians, Turks, Kurds, and Israelis fighting for their interests in various regions of the war-torn country. What are the prospects for finally bringing peace, power sharing, and stability to Syria? Joining us from Washington, D.C. in the United States is Dr. Michael Duran, who is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute at Washington, D.C., and a former White House advisor on the Middle East. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Also joining us from Central Israel's Brigadier General in Reserve, Yossi Kupel-Vassel, who is a project director on Middle East developments at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you, my pleasure.
And with me in the studio is our TV7 analyst and host of Watchmen Talk, Mr. Amir Oren. Give us a short analysis. Where are things currently standing in Syria with regard to the raging conflict there? Of course, it's subsided in certain parts of the country, but of course is still very much ongoing in others.
Well, as a good Israeli, hopefully, I'll answer your question with a question of mine. Does the world really care? To be brutally frank about it, who cares about Syria nowadays? Except, of course, for the suffering millions who are trying to eke out a living among all of the problems they have, including U.S. sanctions on fuel during this harsh winter with COVID-19 and bombing by Russians and Turks. And you didn't even mention the Americans among the various forces there, as former President Trump decided to leave Syria, even though his officials managed to delay the final exit of all of the forces. And as we are speaking now, there are still pro forma attempts to get some constitutional compromise, or perhaps the Russian-led effort and the American or UN-led effort, which are yet to converge. So as we look at the third decade of Bashar Assad's rule, which started in the summer of the year 2000, now in its 21st year, and as the 11th year of this conflict looms, it started in March of 2011. You may remember that the defense minister Barak, when he appeared in the Knesset, said at the time that Bashar Assad's days are numbered. So we know what the number is. It's 3,600 days and counting. And the forecast is very gloomy, unless Michael and Yossi tell us otherwise.
Indeed, and the question actually persists. Does the Assad regime actually rule Syria, considering the fact that we see at this stage Russians taking the lead on various projects? We see the Iranians demanding the Assad regime pay back much of its expenses, if you will. Dr. Duran, where are things currently standing on that front? Is there a Syria which we knew before the 2011 uprising?
No, certainly not. That Syria is gone, and I think you just described the Syria that we now have. We have the shell of the former state, and it's backed up by the Russians and the Iranians. And without their forces and their help and their financial help, the Assad regime probably wouldn't even exist. And from my point of view, I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C. I think the biggest change that we're going to see in the near future is the shift in policy from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. When I worked in the White House, I learned something. I learned a lesson that I think has stood me in good stead when trying to understand American policy towards Syria, and that is that the United States never really has a Syria policy. What the United States does in Syria is always an extension of their policy toward other actors, and in particular Iran. And so we're going to see a big shift on the part of the Biden administration back in the direction of the Obama policy toward Iran, that is engagement of Iran, looking for a deal on the nuclear program. And I suspect that that's going to lead to a real tendency on the part of the Biden team to engage with Iran more in Syria. Now, how far they'll be able to go with that, I don't know. Back in the days of Obama, Obama treated Syria as totally a subset of his Iran engagement policy. Under Trump, Trump has now been strongly supportive of of Israeli action against Iran in Syria, and in addition, they put massive sanctions on the regime that have been very crippling financially for the Assad regime. I think the thing that we really want to watch is the extent to which the Biden team is going to want to use Syria as an opportunity to come to an accommodation with Iran. And that's something that personally I don't think is in the interest of the United States or Israel, but that's the dynamic to watch.
Indeed. General Kupil-Vasyl, your take on this, and to what degree do we need to read between the lines when we see Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov coming earlier this week and signaling directly to the Israeli leadership in Jerusalem, saying, please do not attack again. If you do experience certain concerns, you have intelligence about threats. Also with regard to the Iranians, even though he didn't name the Iranians by name, let us know and we will neutralize that threat. Do we see here some new development on the Russian side with regard to this? And how would you consider Israel to respond to such a move by the Russians?
Well, I think that there is an expectation of greater room to maneuver for the Iranians in Syria in the coming period, basically because of the incoming administration in Washington that wants to go back to the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement with Iran. And this included also giving the Iranians enough money and other resources that they will enable them to have better grip over Syria. They did it back in 2015, and they may have the same situation now. Some lessons have been learned during those years, and I hope that the new administration will be more cautious on that, but it doesn't seem so. Until now, they repeatedly say that what they want to do is to go back to the agreement, and the agreement means lifting the sanctions. And the agreement means that the Iranians are going to have more resources and more money to finance their activities there. And this is extremely dangerous from an Israeli point of view. Israel was trying to take advantage of the Trump administration being in power, to take action in order to prevent Iran from having this presence in Syria. And in the last few days, there are many reports about more and more attacks that are being conducted just to take advantage of the last few minutes and to clear the list of targets before the administration changes. But definitely the Russians as well believe that they have now an opportunity to better guard their proteges and their proxies, and they are going to do that. And this message coming from Lavrov is in the same context. I think that that Israel will face here a challenge. And it is necessary for Israel to clarify to everybody that Israel, even if it's going to be under Biden, is not going to accept the strengthening of Iran in Syria. It's a vital interest of Israel to make sure that Iran is not enjoying better conditions in Syria. And I'm also afraid, as I was for many years, that the Iranians take advantage of Syrian territory in order to promote the nuclear project as well, on certain issues that they can move forward in Syria. So it's very important that Israel will be able to present to the Americans what is the meaning of Iranian presence in Syria and why it should be taken care of very rapidly and very decisively. That is where we stand, I think, in this respect. The Russians, as long as we had the clear green light from the Americans to conduct this, to go on with this policy throughout the last 4 years, had to live with it. Now I think they believe that they may promote some changes. I hope they're wrong, but I'm afraid they might be a little bit right in the context of the American policy.
Concerns that should be taken into account. Mr. Owen, of course, the Assad regime continues to battle various groups within Syria, including in the northwestern province where Idlib, where there are various jihadist organizations present. Of course, a influx of refugees coming from that jihadist infested territory may also pose a threat to Turkey, which is also actively combating with the Assad regime. But there seem to be various signals coming out of Damascus and also Ankara with regard to try and limit the Iranian presence in Syria, because also in Damascus they understand that the Iranian presence there might not be in their best interest, even though it is a fact that the Iranians kept the Assad regime in power because of the boots on the ground. Many various militias from the Lebanese Hezbollah to other organizations that acquiesced to the call of the Iranians to go and support the Assad regime. But it seems that now more and more actors are trying to, I wouldn't say exploit the last day of the Trump administration, but are trying to bring a certain change on the reality on the ground and see this transition of power into the Biden administration actually build a certain momentum in which they would be able to secure their own interests to a certain degree. How do you see that shift occurring?
Well, the Biden team, as well as the other members of the old Obama administration, went out of office in January of 2017. And that was another Middle East. It is not the same as it is today, and obviously it is not the same Middle East which we had 6 years ago when the JCPOA was negotiated. And one is concerned that the formative years of the top echelon of the Biden administration, Secretary of State nominee Blinken, and National Security Advisor Sullivan, and others, and especially the Secretary of Defense designate General Austin, they have all been trained on the Middle East when Daesh was supreme. And this was the main challenge at the time, and one reason why the United States saw Iran as an ally against Daesh. Regardless of the other problems the United States had and still has with Iran, vis-a-vis the Islamic State, Iran and the United States were in cahoots. Now it is no longer so, and one hopes that it has been erased from memory by these officials. And by the way, Israelis in the defense realm who have known General Lloyd Austin when he was the commanding general at CENTCOM, were not impressed by the way he saw problems and foresaw these problems. They were, of course, much more impressed with General Mattis, who was his predecessor at CENTCOM and was replaced by the Obama administration with General Austin. So it remains to be seen whether the new team will get used to the idea that this is 2021, that this is not the Middle East of old, and that it will, first of all, give Israel a free hand in pursuing what started indeed 4 years ago in January of 2017, when General Gadi Eisenkot brought to the Israeli cabinet the idea of attacking the Quds Force positions in Syria. A very, very successful campaign. It did not push Iran and its proxies completely out of Syria. This is perhaps not a practical mission to give the Israeli Defense Forces and intelligence community, but it has pushed the Iranians and their proxies away from the Golan Heights front. Of course, there are other problems there, Hezbollah and what is called the Golan File with the Syrian Defense Forces. So Israel, first of all, is interested in what happens near its boundary, but also what happens near the Syrian-Jordanian border because of its defense cooperation with Jordan, the Tanef circle, Tanef enclave. So there's a lot on the plate of the new administration, and there should be a consultation with Israel before its policy is formalized.
Dr. Duran, you served under the George W. Bush administration, as you also mentioned, that the director on the Middle East within the National Security Council, among other various jobs that you assumed and worked on. From your own experience, how do you see the current administration under President Joe Biden coming in and trying to shift or change the reality on the ground in Syria at a time when expected relations with Turkey, for instance, are not really projected to be that great, at a time when it is more inclined to probably reach JCPOA plus or JCPOA plus plus, depending on who you ask, with regard to the Iranians, when Turkey and Iran are no longer best friends following the Azerbaijan affair, where President Recep Tayyip Erdogan read the poem and then it triggered various backlash from Iran that then, of course, triggered mixed feelings from Turkey as well. And you see a dynamic within a dynamic of various developing stories that ultimately may challenge the Biden administration with all of its experience in the past several years within a new reality.
Yes, let me tell you what I think is going to happen on the basis of the worldview of the Biden team. I hope I'm wrong, but I basically want to reinforce everything that my colleagues here have just said. The Biden administration is going to come in and it's going to have a kind of picture of the globe that doesn't augur well for Israeli attempts to go after Iran and Syria. The big picture they have is that the greatest threat to the United States is the rise of China. And they're going to have the strong sense in the military that it's necessary to cut back resources in the Middle East in order to focus on the China threat. And the answer that they have about how to cut back resources is to cut a deal, a power political agreement with the Russians and the Iranians. There's a strong bias in the Biden administration against Turkey. Some of the senior officials like Brett McGurk, who's going to be the top Middle East advisor for Biden in the White House, is the architect of the U.S. relationship with the YPG, which is the single most important factor in the deterioration of relations between Turkey and the United States. So an alternative viewpoint about how to rebalance American commitments in the globe would be to focus on Turkey and Israel to try to broker a rapprochement between Jerusalem and Ankara, to start the discussion, the strategic discussion with the Turks and the Israelis about the common interests that they have in Syria. The expected Biden tilt toward Iran is of concern to Erdogan and the Turkish national security establishment in general. Turkey doesn't have the same hostility to Iran that Israel does, but Turkey likes its Iran compliant and weak. It doesn't want an Iran that is in the ascendant, and that's what's going to happen given the worldview. That's likely what will happen given the worldview of the Biden administration. And as you mentioned, that poem that Erdogan read in Baku, it was a very beautiful poem, and it brought home, I think, to a lot of people, the shared interests that the Turks and the Israelis have with respect to Iran, and especially with respect to Azerbaijan. The Azerbaijan question is another one where I think you could find room for a strategic dialogue between Israel and Turkey. But I don't expect that at all. I expect the worldview of the Biden team to be focused on coming to an agreement with Russia and Iran. And Israeli operations in Syria are going to be regarded by the Biden team as counterproductive. They are going to be seen as an impediment to the agreement that the Americans need to come to with the Russians and the Iranians. Far be it from me to tell the Israelis what to do with regard to operations, but I don't think, given the worldview, how entrenched those views are in the Biden team, I don't think that that argument with the Biden team is going to change minds. I think that the Israelis have to continue to carry out operations against the Iranians, even under pressure from Washington, and they need to insist that it's an American interest, and it is an American interest, that Syria never become a kind of second Bekaa Valley that threatens American allies from all the territory of Syria.
And I'd like to follow up on this question to you, General Kupelwasser, as we don't have very much time left for today's program. But to what degree is Israel resolved to deal with the Iranian threat in Syria, regardless of the position of the Biden administration in Washington? And beyond that, now that Israel has been shifted from being part of Eurocom and now being brought into Central Command with regard to the area of operations of the United States, much more close within the framework of its newly acquired allies or partners in the region. Do you see a certain emboldening of Israeli operations against the Iranians with regard to thwarting its aspiration to entrench militarily in various areas of strategic importance?
Well, first of all, I think that the degree to which we are committed to prevent Iran from turning Syria into an Iran near our borders is very high. And that said, it's not the only thing that we have as a high priority on our list. We also very much want to see that Iran doesn't make progress on its program to have a big arsenal of nuclear weapons, as they are promised in the JCPOA, actually. So we have a long list of issues that we have to take care of vis-a-vis Iran, and all of those we have the same opinion of we are in the same opinion like our new friends in the Gulf. And the fact that we are now in CENTCOM and not in NUCOM is very important in enabling us to have better coordination with them with American blessing. The question that is now appearing is whether we are going to have a blessing. And I think that Dr. Duran was very much on the point that we hope so. We are afraid that it's not going to happen. That's by judging the names that are on the new team and knowing where they stood on the issue of the JCPOA at the time. Yes, something has changed. I think Amir is correct in saying that something has changed. You don't have in Syria the same problem of ISIS, as we used to have in the past, they are still there. They are still capable of making a lot of damage, but they are not in the same position. They don't control territory. And this is not the same kind of reason for the United States to be friends with Iran and cooperate with Iran. But nevertheless, the commitment to deal with the nuclear program through the JCPOA is something that has its impact all over the place. And for us, it's a critical issue because it's the Iranians are all over Syria, including in the Golden Heights. So it's even if they're not personally there, they have the Hezbollah and the Syrian forces that are operating under their command in the Golan Heights. And it's beyond just that. They are bringing all kinds of weapons through Syria to Hezbollah. They are bringing weapons for themselves in Syria to threaten us. And as I said, I wouldn't rule out the possibility they use Syrian soil for the nuclear project as well. Indeed. So it's, we have to make sure that Iran doesn't control Syria. And I agree with Dr. Duran that we have to be clear on that with the new administration, not only in arguing and explaining, but we have to do that too, but also in our deeds. We should be able to continue with our activities, and we should be trying to explain to the Americans that this is also in the benefit of the United States and of the United States allies in the region. And that's why this is the position we expect the United States to adopt. Whether they are going to do it or not, I think we're in a very critical time in shaping the policy of this new administration. Indeed. One thing is clear, Syria is not going to be the number one issue for the Americans, even in the new situation. It's, there's so many other issues on their plate that I don't expect a Syrian policy even now. Syrian policy will be deducted from the Iran policy and from the regional policy in the Middle East.
And we will have to engage on those topics in next programs, but this is all the time that we have for today. So I'd like to thank General Kupil-Vasil, Dr. Duran, and Mr. Oren for being part of today's program. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.